Welcome to the first presentation. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to Nelson and the colleagues for inviting me to give some information. I'm going to talk today briefly about the standard part 1 and also the relationship to the medical devices regulation, and specifically about the aspects which are, I guess, the key changes relevant to biocompatibility. I'm an external auditor for TÜVSÜD, but it's clear to say that this is not a TÜVSÜD presentation. This is my opinion and my interpretations. But I work quite closely with some of the colleagues there, and thanks to Dr. Christina Reifsteck for her input to some of the slides and some of the information. But this is my view, not a TÜVSÜD official presentation, just to make that clear in case you have questions later. What I'll talk about is a little bit about what the changes and why the changes occurred, especially from the MDD to the MDR. And I'll go through some of the main changes, but there's not time to do all of this. So we could spend the whole day looking at nothing but the MDR biocompatibility changes. We could spend at least a day on 10993 part 1. So this really is a highlight, and I've missed out some things, but I've tried to put in what I think is the important point to get across, which is very much to do with chemical characterization of the device and the materials you have. Okay, so firstly, a little bit of history. Back in 1986, the UK, Canada, and the US put together some guidance on biocompatibility. This became a standard a little bit later on, 1992, the title being Biological Evaluation of Medical Devices, Evaluation and Testing. Okay, that was the restriction. And the standard was very much to do with testing of devices, not about risk assessment. The US put this into the G95 in 1995. The standard was revised in 2003, and then again in 2009. And this time they amended the scope, or the title, to include within a risk management process. And this is a significant change in that we've moved away from doing a standard for testing, but to actually evaluating the safety of a device, of which testing may be part of that. The standard was then last revised in 2018. The US updated their requirements in 2016. I don't know whether this is being replaced now by the standard. I don't think it has been. But I think what we have here now is much more closely aligned with the US requirements, so hopefully it's a far more acceptable standard from that perspective. Just in summary, so we had 3 versions of the standard, which was evaluation and testing. We had 2 versions which included the risk management approach. And then from a regulatory perspective, it's actually 30 years we've had directives for medical devices. Okay, things have changed a lot in that time, but these directives have stood their time. This covered the active implants, and then 3 years later we had the medical device directive, and then in 2017, 13 years later, we've got this new regulation. I say new, it's almost 3 years old. How many people here have actually CE marked against the medical device regulation? Nobody. How many are very close? That's good. I won't ask how many are not close at all. I don't want to embarrass anybody. What I would say from a notified body perspective, as far as I'm aware, even the notified bodies for the MDR are not issuing MDR certificates. At the moment, they're absolutely full as they can be in reissuing medical device directive certificates. So when it comes to after May the 26th, they'll then start doing MDR certificates again. Okay, there's a big demand to extend what you've already got and just delay the pain until some years later. Okay, so the key points of the change from the MDD to the MDR is to do with the detail. Okay, the actual requirements are not massively different. There are some differences, but the focus has changed. So rather than saying the device must be safe, it must have a low risk, they're now telling you what to do to achieve that. Okay, so it's far more prescriptive. You're not allowed to think in the same way as before. Or maybe I should put it, you aren't allowed to get away with not doing what they expected you to do as you could before. So we have these two directives. These were not particularly big documents, 60 pages here, 22 recitals, there's now over 100. The articles have gone from 23 to 123, 12 to 16 annexes, and these essential requirements, which are the basic requirements, we now have from 13 to 23, and they're recalled the general safety and performance requirements. What's changed here? I mean, this document is about 2.5 times the size of these two put together. And again, it's not so much down to a lot of new requirements, it's just really telling you in a lot more detail what you should always have been doing in the past. In terms of biocompatibility, we had 3 essential requirements, we've now got 4. Okay, and the content here is probably just over double the length it was in the MDD. So in some respects, it's an easier document to work with because it's telling you what to do in more detail than before. If we look at the actual directives, the active implant essential requirement 9, the MDD 7.1, 7.2 and 7.5, and we've now got these here. So these two are not massively changed. In fact, 7.2 is the same in the regulation as it is in the directive. 7.1 I'll talk about in a minute because this is a little bit more detailed. And there's been quite a big change in the area to do with substances leaking from the device, like phthalates. There's also one new one here, which I'll talk about as well, to do with the physical nature. So, that doesn't help. Every different laptop, then the red markers move to a different position, so I apologise for that, but this should be around here. The next 3 slides, the text in black is word for word the same in the Medical Device Directive and the regulation, okay? The only differences are the blue text. So if I read this here, this is 10.1 GSPR. Devices shall be designed and manufactured in such a way as to ensure that the characteristics and performance requirements are fulfilled. Okay, and they've changed the word, that was guarantee, it's now ensure. In English, there's not a big difference in the meaning. There's no difference in intention. You'll pay particular attention to the choice of materials, substances, particularly as regards toxicity. So they've added in the term substance here. And again, within English, the term material more defines something which is made out of a combination of things, whereas sodium chloride is just a substance. So again, there's no change in the intention here, but the English is a little bit more inclusive so that you can't get out of doing something by claiming it's a substance rather than the material. I'm being a skeptic now. The second point is the same as before. We've got the compatibility between the materials and substances used and the biological tissues, cells and body fluids. And this takes account of the intended purpose. This is the device categorization from ISO10993 Part 1. Again, there's no real difference here. They've added in some text, where relevant, the absorption, distribution, metabolism and excretion. Again, those were always expected to be covered for devices where those were relevant, especially absorbable implants, devices leaching. And I think in terms of what you'll see from a notified body perspective, then there will be a little bit of a closer look at these. So if you've got devices like an infusion set, you should know what level of, for example, DEHP can leach out of that set to the patient. And maybe you've not looked at that before. And if that chemical is in the patient, how is it metabolized and excreted by the body? Sorry, these have grown a little bit. The last point is the impact of processes on material properties. Again, that was not in the Medical Device Directive, but it was in the 10993, so that's again nothing new. If you think about, in particular, injection molding, extrusion, chemical bonding, sterilization by gamma rays, sterilization of ethylene oxide, all of these have an impact on the materials. So it's not just about understanding the chemistry of the raw material you buy, but it's understanding the chemistry as to what you've made through the manufacturing processes. Nothing new, but it's specifically stated now in the regulation. Surface properties now specifically mentioned. Again, really not new for implants in particular. And then we've now got this one, which I think is more significant. So we've got confirmation the device meets any defined chemical and or physical specifications. And I think that does introduce some new requirements or at least new expectations. So you need to confirm it meets any specifications. Is that a design process? Is that design validation, design verification, or is that part of your standard production process or the purchasing process for raw materials? You need to define the detail for your specifications. It's quite simple for something. Some metal alloys are purchased to make hip implants, for example, and they'll come with a certificate of analysis with the various alloy components and mixes. Other things like polyvinyl chloride tubing is more complicated because you don't know what the manufacturers put into that. They won't tell you. You need to assess that. So this, I think, will highlight the need for more detail in your technical documentation for the chemical and physical nature of the product. This next GSPR 10.4, this talks about what was covered in the directive as phthalates with endocrine disrupting property, or CMR properties. Okay. Within the MDR, they've expanded this and put a lot more detail in. So we've now got, and I've abbreviated the text here, but devices must be designed and manufactured to reduce as far as possible the risks posed by substances or particles, wear debris, degradation, processing residues that may be released. This was minimized before. Now that's quite a significant change, and we've had a big discussion within our industry about risk management. The ISO 10993-1 standard, you're about judging risk. You bring it down to a level that you judge is acceptable with the benefits outweighing the risks. According to the wording here, you have to reduce it as far as possible. It doesn't matter if you consider that safe, you have to continue to reduce it lower. And I don't think that's possible. I don't think it's from a philosophy of risk management, it doesn't make sense. That's not risk management. If you want zero risk, you don't have a device. It's as simple as that. So be careful of this. Make sure that you have taken all practical, feasible, reasonable steps to reduce the risks with respect to any chemicals leaching out of the device. And I think that will require you to do more types of testing or more detailed testing so you can really objectively show what those risks are. It then goes on, so the special requirements for devices containing phthalates, for example, include risk assessment in the MDD. They include labeling of the device to warn the user, any special precautions if they're used on the patient groups. And in the MDD, they cover devices for infusion and transfusion, like infusion sets, and they cover things like blood bags for storing medicine, storing blood tissue components. They've now added in this additional category, invasive devices in direct contact with the human body. So that covers everything from scalpels and forceps to surgical gloves. You now need to consider whether these contain any of these substances. Okay, so that's a much bigger category of devices than was covered before. What you need to do, the requirement is that they'll only contain these substances. It was just phthalates with CMR properties. It's now all carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxic, CMR, and all endocrine disrupting materials, not just phthalates. And you have to justify their inclusion. And it tells you in detail in this next section, which I'm not going to show, how to do the justification. The reality is you're not trying to justify why it's acceptable. You're justifying the good and the bad. Okay, and in my opinion, I don't see how you can justify the use of DHP in things like infusion sets. I don't think it's possible to justify that if you're following this set of requirements. It goes on to have a limit here, so you only need to follow all these requirements if there's more than 0.1% weight by weight. Okay, that's the trigger point. I'm not sure exactly where this comes from, but we think it comes from the REACH regulation, which is to do with restriction of hazardous chemicals. Okay, but in practice, a big device will have much more phthalate in than a small device, even if it's below 0.1%. Okay, so just bear in mind, if you've got devices that fall into this category here, there's quite a lot of additional requirements and documentation needed. One other point, if you've got phthalates, for example, in your device, even if it's less than 0.1%, you still need to do a risk assessment of that as part of the general product risk assessment, okay? This doesn't apply only if it's below a certain level. The detail does, but in terms of the other points, then you still have to cover that. Right, one more. This is the last, this is additional GSPR, and it's to do with particles. And you need to make sure you take into account the size of particles, especially nanomaterials, and the properties that they have. Nothing really new, but it wasn't really thought about when we had the Medical Device Directive. And this is aimed at some of the new devices containing nanomaterials, but also many existing devices which are releasing particles, especially some of these metal implants for hips and so on. A few other points within the regulation. This is also in the Annex 1. Instructions for use. How many people make implants here? A few people. There's a requirement for implantable devices that your instructions for use will identify, i.e. qualitative, what materials it's made from, what's the alloy, and the quantitative information that the patient's exposed to. So if you've got implantable devices, you'll need to put in instructions for use, what it's made from, and what level of chemicals will be released over the duration of use of that implant in the body. Okay? So you'll need to have some fairly detailed leachable and extractable studies for this. My understanding from the notified bodies is that the qualitative information will need to be there, but the quantitative information they're probably not going to look at in the short term so much. There's more important things to worry about with the MDR. But you do need to consider that. And obviously, if every batch is different, should you be batch testing for the instructions for use? I hope not, because that's quite complicated in terms of managing. If we move on to Annex 2, this is the technical documentation, and there's a big list of things required to be part of your technical documentation, one of which, and this is the important bit, is detailed information regarding... Now, if you imagine doing biocompatibility testing, this is what you're expected to have for these test processes, these protocols. Test design. Okay, why have you done the test that way? Mostly they're based on the ISO10993 standards, but you might follow the pharmacopoeial methods instead. The complete test or study protocols. That is very commonly missing from a notified body perspective. Okay, companies have the test report, but not the protocols. And typically it's because the protocols have followed pharmacopoeial monographs, but that's not sufficient for medical devices. You need to summarize the test method, in particular, the preparation of the product samples. How are the samples prepared, ready for testing? So you need to have the test design information, protocols, how you analyze the data, and the data summaries of the results and the conclusions. So that must be documented for all of these. And there's a big list of things. I've only put the biocompatibility ones here. So we've got biocompatibility, so identification of, these are of materials, and in particular, the physical and chemical characterization. And again, this is pushing back the big focus in this regulation. You need to know what you're dealing with. Because in theory, if you know what chemicals you've got, you can judge those risks without needing to do testing. It's maybe not quite as simple as that in practice, but there's a big emphasis on you maybe doing some actual leachable and extractable studies and for doing a proper literature search to find information on the safety of these. One last thing on technical documentation, this is to do with microbiology, sterile devices or low bioburden devices. There's a need to include the validation reports for pyrogen testing and sterilant residues. Okay, so these are both relevant to biocompatibility. If you've got ethylene oxide, this is part 7 of the standard. For pyrogen testing comes under, is it part 11? But the question people are asking is, does it mean it's mandatory to do pyrogen testing? Well, from a notified body perspective, no. Okay, this clause deals with sterile devices. You need to consider material-mediated pyrogenicity based on the materials you're using. And for sterilization, you would consider endotoxins from a sterility point of view. Okay, they're two different things. So although it does state here you will have to do pyrogen testing, from a notified body perspective, at least from talking to notified bodies, they're looking at this as more aimed at LAL testing for endotoxin. Okay, you might need material-mediated pyrogen testing, but that's a separate endpoint. Right, just a few words on the standard. This was published in August 2018. It was corrected in 2010. It is considered state-of-the-art, but it is not harmonized. Okay, I personally think, it's a personal view, that harmonization is a waste of time. I don't think it adds anything. I think it was very important when the Medical Device Directive came out because no one was really working with standards. But this is state-of-the-art. Okay, so you really need to follow this. There's a requirement to follow state-of-the-art. It's down for harmonisation. The latest date is in May 2024. So maybe it won't get harmonised for a long time. I don't know. I'm not involved with the technical committees. What's important, it's very closely aligned with the MDR. Okay, so they go hand in hand, these two documents. Just a brief talk about some of the changes. This is table A1, and it talks about the endpoints to consider. The ones in green here are all new. These are additions. And the important thing is that, I can't see this very well, but this column here has X's. An X is a prerequisite. You have to do it. Okay, you have to have chemical and physical information. The rest of these are E's. These are endpoints to consider. You don't have to test for these, but you should be looking for data to support the safety of your device against these endpoints. That might come from testing, it might come from extractable testing, it may come from biological safety testing, it may come from the raw material manufacturer, it may come from your risk assessment, okay? But it doesn't mean you have to do all those testing. All of these are new. These were not in the previous version of 10993, and there's one test they've taken out that was a requirement as an endpoint, which is no longer there. Okay, so there's a big increase in what you need to consider in your risk assessment. Brief summary as to everything within. This is just the main points I think are important. We need to evaluate the advantage, disadvantage, and relevance of. That's a very significant statement. This is not about you justifying why something's safe, but you need to talk about the disadvantages of that material. Why have you used that and not something else? Is it down to cost? That's not a good enough excuse. I mean, the cost of switching from DHP to a different plasticizer is expensive for validation and shelf life and everything else. But that wouldn't get you, that wouldn't be an acceptable rationale for not doing it. So make sure you consider this in particular. It talks here about the device configuration, the qualitative list of materials, and where necessary, the proportionate amount. This is quantitative. And the need for physical and chemical characteristics for the construction materials. And again, for all of this, you're looking at 1, 2, 3 different things: advantage, disadvantage, relevance. And that needs to be documented. We talk about packaging materials, maybe not really new, but most people haven't considered it. If there's a 5-year shelf life, that product is in packaging contact for 5 years. So maybe something's leaching out during that time. So when it comes to doing some studies, extractable, leachable, or cytotoxicity, whatever it might be, should this be in 5 years and not at the beginning? Or should it be both? How many people have tested their product at the end of the shelf life for biocompatibility? 2, 3 people. It's not very common in my experience, at least. Sorry? It depends, yeah. It depends. On some things change, some leach very quickly. Most packaging materials that we use in devices are very well known and characterized. Particle size, we talked about, that's fairly new because it's new technology. This is important, safety of the whole life cycle. So again, during the aging of a device, when it sits on the shelf, what is the impact of that? Not just the packaging on it, but its own change. I know from my experience, if you took 5-year-old PVC tubing and you squeezed it, it felt physically harder than tubing that was new, even though it's the same tubing. It's a very subjective test. I'm not suggesting you should use that, but you can notice the change over time. And if you have devices which are reprocessable or reusable, you need to consider the maximum number of processing cycles. So if the device can be used 200 times, you need to reprocess 200 times and then consider your extractables, leachables, chemical nature, and everything else. And that's quite a big bunch of work. And lastly, I mentioned already the endpoints to consider. Okay, I want to highlight one thing which I think is proving difficult from a notified body perspective. Within the standard, 411 talks about, there's a statement, the standard does not mandate additional testing. Okay, so although we've seen the Annex A1, there's additional endpoints to consider, it is not stating you have to go and test for all of those things. And they use some wording here, if there's appropriate data for the safe history of use. But what does that really mean? Well, if it's been on the market for 20 years, there's no complaints. Does that mean it's okay? Any volunteers to say yes? No, it's not sufficient. And I think you'll find notified bodies are quite picky on this, okay? You can't just use, for example, complaint data. It's just not sufficient. And the fact that you've got a regulatory approval been on the market maybe in the US for 20 years does not mean it's safe. Complaint analysis is not sufficient. And you need to look at all of the post-market surveillance data. So we've got PMCF. This is important, doing literature searches to find, have things occurred and been reported, which you need to know about. Adverse incidents. If you've got certain devices, there's some device registries for things like implants in Scandinavia. These are very good to find information. Make sure the data you find here is appropriate for your endpoint. So for example, genotoxicity, you will never get a complaint saying your device was genotoxic. You just won't pick it up by the use in the patient. So some of the endpoints that are relevant, you aren't going to find by looking at complaint data, for example, or post-market. And make sure the data you do find is relevant to the patients and things that you've got, that your device is used on. Okay, so that was the main part of the changes to the standard that are relevant and to the regulation. Please consider these two. Part 17, Ted's going to talk about in a minute. No, he's not. Someone's talking about part 17. Sorry. Is it correct? It's not been published yet as a standard. I know it's close to the revision. This covers the leachable allowable limits. Part 18 was published this year. This is to do with chemical characterization, a very important part to support your compliance to the MDR, and we'll hear some more about that later today. And part 19 is talking about the physical characterization of the device. Okay, so make sure you've covered that. It's more commonly used for implantable devices, devices of flowing blood, but it's relevant to all devices. So at least have something documented in your files about how you've considered this. So I'm running out of time, so I shall be brief. Notified bodies. We currently have 11 notified bodies for the MDR. Some have two, BSI and DECRA. As you're probably aware, in the UK, we voted to leave the EU. And we lost all of our notified body business, which was one of the main countries for this, but that is what it is. State of the art, okay? You're expected to meet for the MDR state of the art, meet the GSPRs, and actually have evidence for this. We'd also expect you to comply with the 2018 version of the standard. If you're working with the previous version, for the MDD, that's acceptable. For the MDR, it's not. Okay, so you do need to make sure you meet these before you apply for MDR certification. And basically this means that you have to cover your chemical and physical information. Make sure you've documented it. Additional endpoints have been considered. You've justified why you haven't done testing if you've not done additional testing. You've covered the full life cycle. And the most important thing is please just have some evidence. If you submit just a pile of test reports, that will not be acceptable. You need to review those and to judge what it means from a risk point of view. And lastly, if you're working with the MDD, if you've extended your EC certificates for the next few years, state of the art is the 2018 version, but it's accepted to work with the previous version except for changes. If you make changes to your device, make sure you're following the 2018 version. Right, in conclusion, so we've got this regulation and the standard. They both came out at similar times. They're both very closely aligned. Okay, there's no conflicts between the two. The standard does give more detail than the MDR. The MDR gives a lot more detail than the MDD. Make sure you understand how these changes affect your products. Do a gap analysis and document it. Okay, show that you've considered what the differences are and then justify why you've done stuff or not done stuff. For changes, make sure you follow the 2018 standard, even if you're going to continue with the MDD. And please bear in mind that notified bodies are very busy at the moment. There's a shortage of staff, they're training new staff. The other thing is most of the reviewers, not most, a lot of the reviewers are new. It takes 4 years to train people in notified bodies before they're competent and can make judgments. When they're new, they're more scientific about things. They struggle to judge it. They'll just say, it doesn't meet this, it's wrong. Okay, so you'll need to explain things more, unfortunately, to begin with. And lastly, if you've got a biological evaluation, even under the MDD, that does not consider chemical and physical characterization, this will not be accepted under the MDD or the MDR or the AIMDD. Okay, you need to have that information. It's been a requirement for many, many years. It's not new. It was just never enforced.